there are wars you read about in history books. Wars with borders, treaties, and soldiers in matching uniforms. And then, there are wars that exist in shadows. Wars without rules, without limits. Wars where a single road, a single hill, a single warehouse can decide the fate of entire communities. This is one of those wars. Tonight, we go inside a conflict that has shaped Mexico's future in silence. A war fought not in far-off battlefields, but along everyday streets. Between two organizations whose names are whispered with fear. From Sinaloa to Veracruz, from Guadalajara to the U.S. border. The Sinaloa Cartel. And the CJNG, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation. Two giants. Two empires. One territory, worth more than gold, more than oil. More than anything a government could publicly admit. A corridor so valuable that anyone who controls it controls the flow of a fortune built on routes, ports, and secrecy. But here's the truth. No one truly controls it for long. The scene widens in your mind. A remote stretch of highway in western Mexico. One that locals avoid after sunset. A highway lined with broken asphalt and the scent of dust. And the unspoken memory of what happened here. On nights like this, truck drivers don't slow down. They don't blink. They don't pull over, not even for police lights. Because everyone remembers the convoy. A charred armored truck. A single survivor crawling from the wreckage. The quiet crackle of flames chewing through metal. The echo of a voice on a radio screaming for backup that never arrived. Authorities would later call it an ambush. A confrontation between rival groups. A criminal event. But the people who live here, they know better. They know the look of a professional operation. The precision. The timing. The message. Because in this war, nothing is random. Nothing is accidental. Every bullet has an intention. Every silence has a meaning. And that night, that one night, was the moment the world realized something had shifted. The rules were gone. The balance was broken. And whatever fragile peace existed between Sinaloa and CJNG had been shattered forever. But here's the question no one can answer. How do two cartels, both powerful, both deeply rooted, both feared, end up locked in a battle for the exact same stretch of land? Why this area? Why now? And what exactly was worth dying for? Because according to investigators, journalists, leaked intelligence reports, and countless testimonies from locals caught in the crossfire, the war for this territory didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a whisper. A betrayal. A quiet shift in loyalty that spiraled into open fire. And once the first domino fell, nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop what came next. Not police. Not military operations. Not negotiations. Not even arrests of high-profile leaders. Every attempt to calm the storm only fed it. As we peel back the layers of this conflict tonight, you'll hear about alliances made in darkness. Tactics borrowed from military training. Towns caught between two giants. And a series of decisions, made by men hundreds of miles away, that turned entire communities into battlefields. You'll see how a hidden economy, a network of local groups, and the geography of Mexico itself became weapons in a struggle for dominance. And by the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand one chilling truth. This war is not just about drugs. Not just about power. Not even about money. It's about control. Control of a strategic lifeline so valuable, That whoever holds it can reshape the map of organized crime in Mexico. But before we can get to the moment everything explodes, before the betrayals, the ambushes, the shifting alliances, and the battle that would redefine both cartels, we need to go back. Back to when this territory was peaceful. Back to when a silent agreement held everything in place. Back to when Sinaloa saw itself as untouchable. And CJNG was rising faster than anyone could predict. Because to understand the war, they say, you must first understand the spark. And to understand the spark, you must understand the two forces rushing toward each other. Long before they even realized they were on a collision course. This is where the story truly begins. If you want to understand why two of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere would risk everything, money, influence, soldiers, alliances, and legacy, you have to start with the land itself. Not the mountains or the coastline. Not even the cities whose names appear in headlines. I'm talking about a region of Mexico that looks, on the surface, like any other cluster of rural towns and dusty road networks. A region outsiders barely glance at when driving past. A region where even the locals can't quite agree on where it begins or ends, because the boundaries aren't written on maps. They're written in control. Stretching across western and central Mexico lies a corridor that quietly feeds a multi-billion-dollar criminal economy. A territory shaped by rivers, valleys, deep canyons, mountain passes, two major coastal access points, and highways that lead north like arteries. To the untrained eye, it appears ordinary. But to the cartels? It is priceless. Because whoever controls this corridor controls movement. And movement, uninterrupted, unchecked, and undisputed, is everything. This region connects the Pacific coast to inland states. It links farmland to factories, ports to highways, and local groups to larger networks. It gives access to shipping routes, clandestine airstrips, and rural zones where enforcement struggles to reach. It is a funnel. A bridge. A lifeline. A place where silence is currency, and control is power. And for years, one name dominated this expanse without question: Sinaloa. But power, especially power built on routes, alliances, and influence, cannot remain unchallenged forever. And in the shadows of that dominance, another force was rising. Faster, more aggressive, and more determined than anyone had predicted. If you strip away the myths, the rumors, and the sensationalism, you're left with simple logistics. This corridor is valuable because it connects everything to everything. From the Pacific coast, where legal and illegal shipments flow in and out, to the interior states where local groups, factories, and distribution networks operate behind everyday life. From there, long highways wander north, toward border crossings that generate unimaginable wealth for whoever controls them. Control here isn't about owning the land. It's about managing movement. Regulating who can pass. Who pays. Who is protected. And who disappears. It's about who has information first. Who has eyes on every road. Who can enforce silence when needed. And who can guarantee, without hesitation, that their route remains untouched. This territory is a puzzle of influence. Local groups who know every dirt path. Transporters who know every mile of road. Families who have lived here for generations. Political figures who have learned to navigate pressure from every direction. And the two most powerful cartels in Mexico, each trying to lock their grip on the corridor. To outside governments, it's a security concern. To journalists, it's a long-running mystery. To authorities, it's a problem with no single solution. But to organized crime? It is the crown jewel. and the reason both cartels are willing to bleed for it is brutally simple. If you control the corridor, you control the future. For years, the Sinaloa Cartel operated like a multinational corporation, patient, strategic, and deeply rooted. They built alliances that lasted decades. They relied on experience, negotiation, and a network so wide that it stretched beyond Mexico's borders. They favored stability over chaos, influence over spectacle, relationships over raw force. That was their strength. But also their vulnerability. Because somewhere else in Mexico, another organization was growing. One that didn't care about tradition, or balance, or the unwritten agreements that kept certain territories quiet. The CJNG, or Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generation, grew like a wildfire, fast, aggressive, and fueled by a level of organization that shocked observers worldwide. Their rise wasn't accidental. It was tactical. They moved directly, decisively, unapologetically. Where Sinaloa negotiated, CJNG confronted. Where Sinaloa waited, CJNG advanced. Where Sinaloa relied on long-standing relationships, CJNG built new ones from scratch with overwhelming force. They didn't just want territory. They wanted dominance. And to gain dominance, they set their sights on the same corridor Sinaloa had quietly controlled for years. For a time, the tension remained invisible to the public. Subtle. Hidden beneath layers of silence and unspoken arrangements. But friction was inevitable. One group relied on history. The other relied on momentum. One expanded slowly and carefully. The other expanded rapidly and ruthlessly. Their collision wasn't a matter of if. It was a matter of when. As the world focused on headlines, politics, and arrests in other parts of Mexico, the ground beneath this corridor was shifting. Local groups noticed it first. New faces. New rules. New expectations. New warnings. Authorities felt it too. Quiet tension. Unexpected activity. Movements after midnight that didn't align with known patterns. Even civilians could sense it. The silence felt heavier. The nights felt longer. The roads felt different. Because when two giants move toward the same territory, the land itself seems to brace for impact. This wasn't a dispute. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was the slow tightening of a vice. Sinaloa, the old power, holding the corridor with decades of influence. CJNG, the fast-rising force, hungry for expansion. Both recognizing that only one could dominate the route that shaped everything else. And once both sides made their intentions clear, the stage was set. Not for a negotiation. Not for a compromise. But for a war. One that would redefine control in Mexico. One that would expose alliances, secrets, and betrayals buried deep within the region. One that would show just how far each side was willing to go. And that brings us to the moment where the true story begins. Not with the first gunshot. Not with the first ambush. But with the silent shifts that preceded them. Because before the violence, before the battles, before the war exploded into the open, something happened. Something subtle. Something quiet. Something that would unravel everything that followed. To understand how this war began, we need to go back. The truth is, this war didn't appear out of thin air. It wasn't born from a single act of violence or a single man's ambition. It was shaped long before bullets started flying, shaped in the quiet rooms where deals were made, in the forgotten villages where poverty built desperation, and in the mountains where loyalty wasn't a choice, but a way to survive. To understand how two of the most powerful criminal organizations on Earth collided, we must go backward, into the roots of each cartel, into the moments that carved their identities, and into the tension that simmered for years before finally erupting into a full-scale war. This is where the story truly begins. Long before anyone had heard the letters CJNG, the Sinaloa Cartel already cast a shadow across Mexico's criminal landscape. Sinaloa wasn't just a cartel, it was a system. A structure so deeply embedded into the region that its influence stretched from dusty rural roads to international corridors of power. Its foundation wasn't built on chaos, but on organization. On hierarchy. On a philosophy that business could be conducted quietly, strategically, long before fists were clenched or triggers were pulled. In the mountains of the Golden Triangle, generations survived off the land, many caught between hunger or harvesting the crops the cartels demanded. From that environment came leaders who understood loyalty, terrain, patience. Men who didn't need to shout to prove power. Among them, a leadership style formed, something calculated, almost corporate. Instead of chaos, they preferred alliances. Instead of reckless battles, they brokered agreements that allowed money to flow without unnecessary bloodshed. Violence existed, yes, but it was the final play, not the opening move. As the years passed, Sinaloa expanded beyond borders. They developed relationships with producers in South America, distributors in the United States, and networks that reached into cities thousands of miles away. With every corridor they controlled, their influence tightened. Entire towns, police forces, and political offices leaned, quietly or openly, on Sinaloa's reach. For a long time, the cartel seemed untouchable. But the world was changing. And far from Sinaloa's mountains, something new was forming. Something younger. Something faster. Something far more aggressive. While Sinaloa refined its empire, a new force began rising from the remnants of older criminal groups, one that wouldn't follow the old rules or pay respect to the old kings. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel did not grow slowly, nor did it try to blend into the shadows. It erupted onto the scene. CJNG was born from a generation raised in a Mexico already soaked in violence. Young recruits enter the cartel with a different mindset, speed over strategy, dominance over diplomacy. Trained with paramilitary precision and armed with modern tactics, CJNG didn't negotiate for territory. They seized it. They didn't wait to be recognized. They forced the world to acknowledge them. Where Sinaloa preferred networks and quiet arrangements, CJNG built itself around shock and awe. They understood power in the modern age, how fear spreads through videos, how convoys of armored trucks rolling through towns could cripple resistance without firing a shot, how modern communication could make a single event echo across the entire country overnight. Their message became unmistakable. We are not here to coexist. We are here to take everything. They targeted regions overlooked by older cartels, isolated towns desperate for protection, areas where government presence was thin, places where the population would accept the cartel that arrived first and strongest. Each victory fed the next. Each expansion emboldened them further. And each time they were challenged, their response was louder, faster, deadlier. To the public, CJNG became a storm, unpredictable and devastating. To the older cartels, they became something far worse, a threat that respected no boundary. And among those older cartels, the one they threatened most was Sinaloa. At first, Sinaloa and CJNG occupied different worlds, different philosophies, different geographies, different ambitions. But cartels, like nations, cannot grow without eventually colliding. What began as distant movements soon became noticeable incursions. Territories that had long been regarded as untouchable, regions controlled by Sinaloa for decades, started showing signs of a new presence. A few local bosses quietly shifted their loyalty. A handful of Sinaloa-affiliated distributors vanished, replaced by CJNG operatives. A shipment was intercepted by unknown assailants. Sinaloa noticed, of course. But they had seen rivals before. Rivals came and went. The cartel had weathered storms stronger than these early disruptions, or so they believed. Then came the moment that made ignoring CJNG impossible. A convoy transporting Sinaloa lieutenants was ambushed in a territory the cartel had dominated for years. It wasn't a random attack. It was coordinated, precise, and devastating. The message was unmistakable. CJNG was not testing the waters. They were declaring themselves. Suddenly, the leadership in Sinaloa understood that this was not another small-time group trying to carve space. This was a cartel with ambition equal to their own, ambition backed by firepower and fearlessness. From that moment, every move mattered. Every shift in territory. Every rumor of CJNG soldiers passing through the night. Every whisper of communities switching allegiances. The old equilibrium was cracking. The tension between Sinaloa and CJNG grew thicker with every month that passed. Sinaloa tried reinforcing key territories, strengthening alliances, and re-establishing their presence. But CJNG interpreted caution as opportunity. Every time Sinaloa hesitated, CJNG pushed a little further. Every quiet retreat created another foothold for the rising cartel. By the early 2010s, analysts were warning that Mexico was heading toward a level of violence it had never seen, not because of fragmentation, but because two giants were moving toward each other on a collision course. The inevitability of war didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived in the silence between attacks, in the subtle encroachments, in the understanding that neither cartel would ever tolerate the other's ascent. Both sides kept pushing. Both sides kept escalating. Both sides kept closing the distance. And then, just as the country braced for what felt like an approaching storm, one act of violence shattered the fragile balance. A spark. A moment so brutal, so public, and so impossible to ignore, that it ignited a war that would change Mexico forever. Everything that followed can be traced back to that single moment. Everything changed after one violent spark. The moment that ignited the war did not happen in darkness. It did not occur quietly on some forgotten backroad where violence vanishes into dust. It happened in broad daylight, bold, loud, undeniable. It happened in a place where families shopped, where children laughed, where the normal rhythms of life had kept danger at arm's length, until the danger finally stepped inside. To understand why this moment mattered, imagine a city caught between two shadows. A place where people whispered the names of the cartels but never said them aloud. A place where everyone knew who controlled what street, what neighborhood, what route. In this city, uneasy peace had become a way of life. People were used to seeing things they did not speak about. They adapted. They survived. And then one day, survival wasn't enough. It started with a rumor, one that grew louder as the hours passed. Word spread that a high-ranking Sinaloa operative had been spotted traveling through contested territory. He was known for being cautious, the kind of man who changed vehicles twice in an hour, who never stayed in one safe house for too long, who trusted maps more than people. He wasn't supposed to be here. And the fact that he was here meant something was already wrong. Whether CJNG had been tipped off or whether their surveillance simply outpaced his caution may never be known. What we do know is that a single convoy of CJNG gunmen moved toward the area with ruthless precision. They didn't race in recklessly or stir suspicion. They drove like locals, slow, familiar, unassuming. Until they reached a busy intersection. What happened next unfolded in seconds, but its consequences lasted years. The target's SUV rolled toward a red light. A mother pushed a stroller across the walkway. A vendor handed a child a drink. Car horns echoed between buildings. The city felt like any other Mexican afternoon. And then, in an instant that ripped through the illusion of normalcy, the CJNG convoy boxed in the SUV, one truck in front, one behind, one to the side. Witnesses later said the silence was the worst part. A moment where time seemed to hold its breath. Then the gunfire started. Not panicked, not chaotic, precise. Controlled. The kind of coordinated attack that made it clear this was no message. This was an execution. Bullets shattered glass, shredded metal, pierced seats. The SUV didn't even have time to accelerate. Within seconds, the street was a maze of screaming civilians, overturned vendors' carts, and smoke rising from the wreck. But the moment that truly changed the war wasn't the disappearance of the Sinaloa operative inside. It was what CJNG did next. Instead of fleeing, they stepped out of their vehicles. Masked men, armed as if marching into a battlefield rather than a public street, moved toward the SUV. They pulled the target's body from the wreckage so the world could see exactly what had happened. They wanted cameras rolling, witnesses shaking, phones capturing the scene. They wanted the message to travel farther than bullets ever could. For the first time, CJNG openly struck a high-value Sinaloa figure in a public space, in daylight, without hesitation. They weren't just challenging Sinaloa's power. They were humiliating it. News spread faster than any official statement. People who had witnessed the attack ran home shaking, locking doors, calling relatives. Videos circulated online within minutes, videos that CJNG fully intended to go viral. It wasn't just an assassination. It was theater. It was a declaration. By the time authorities arrived, the convoy was gone. The shooters vanished into traffic like ghosts. Only the wreckage remained, along with the growing certainty that the city, the region, the entire balance of power had changed. For Sinaloa, the consequences were immediate. This wasn't a loss they could ignore. It wasn't an ambush in the shadows or a quiet disappearance. It was public, humiliating, and strategically devastating. They had lost a critical organizer, a man responsible for logistics, finances, and alliances. Losing him meant losing the trust of several smaller groups who depended on his negotiation skills. Those alliances began to waver. Worse, the public nature of the attack made Sinaloa look vulnerable. And in cartel warfare, perception is as deadly as bullets. Inside Sinaloa Command, fury spread. Retaliation was no longer a matter of discussion. It became destiny. Meanwhile, CJNG celebrated the operation as a demonstration of strength. They viewed the daylight strike as a psychological weapon, something that would fracture Sinaloa's confidence while emboldening their own recruits. Their message to rival organizations was unmistakable: if we can hit them like this, imagine what we can do to you. The government's response arrived late and underwhelming. Press conferences promised justice. Security checkpoints appeared. Patrols were deployed. But everyone knew the truth: the state was reacting, not preventing. They were trying to control consequences, not the cause. And in the eyes of civilians, the attack proved something terrifying: that neither the police nor the military could prevent two giants from turning their city into a battlefield. People began leaving the area. Those who stayed avoided main streets. Businesses closed early. Schools shortened hours. Entire neighborhoods felt a shift, like the air itself had become heavier. Behind closed doors, Sinaloa leaders gathered. The humiliation could not stand. Retaliation would come, not with a message, but with destruction. Plans were drawn. Allies were contacted. Weapons were moved. And as if in response, CJNG prepared for the blow they knew was coming. The flashpoint had done more than spark conflict. It tore away the thin veil hiding the rivalry. From that moment on, both cartels stopped pretending the other would back down. What followed wasn't simply escalation, it was transformation. A shift from strategic competition to total war. And the country would soon feel the full weight of it. As the shock settled, Mexico braced for the retaliatory wave. Communities whispered about what would come next. Authorities deployed reinforcements, knowing they would likely be overrun if the fight escalated. And both cartels sharpened their weapons, hardened their ranks, and prepared to strike. The flashpoint did more than ignite a conflict. It drew a line in the sand. A line both sides were now willing to spill oceans of blood to defend. And just when it felt like nothing could be worse than that single, unforgettable moment, the real war began. Everything after the flashpoint was not just reaction. It was escalation. What begins as scattered reports of movement along the contested corridors soon transforms into undeniable shifts on the ground. Within days, the map of control, once stable and predictable, begins to contort in ways that catch even seasoned analysts off guard. One faction executes a lightning push through rural terrain once considered irrelevant, while another quietly secures a cluster of border villages with precise, disciplined efficiency. Lines move so quickly that locals describe waking up under one authority and going to bed under another. Every mile gained is matched by a half-mile lost, turning the landscape into a living scoreboard of ambition and desperation. Bridges are taken at dawn and retaken by dusk. A single crossroads becomes the scene of 3 separate skirmishes in 24 hours, leaving its concrete fractured and its surrounding shops stripped to broken metal frames. Residents pick through rubble, their voices trembling as they describe how the front line moved over them like a storm. One woman recalls hearing distant shots one day, overhead the next, and inside her street the morning after. The speed terrifies her more than the violence itself. It felt like the ground changed under our feet. Ambushes on dirt roads become common. Firefights erupt for only minutes but leave hours of confusion behind. Nighttime exchanges of tracer fire draw glowing arcs across the sky, revealing exhausted silhouettes, young men who haven't slept, who march on hopes so thin they seem transparent. These clashes appear random to outsiders, but every flare of violence is a test, probing the enemy's strength, discipline, and willingness to lose blood for ground that may only matter symbolically. Each confrontation carries the weight of something larger forming on the horizon. Civilians are trapped in the tightening spaces between advancing lines. Entire blocks are abandoned overnight. Families queue for water under distant gunfire, flinching whenever an aircraft passes overhead. Schools convert into shelters. Basements become bunkers. The rhythm of life dissolves into alarms, rumors, and hurried decisions. News crews capture mothers pressing hands against evacuation bus windows, unsure if they will ever return. Aid workers struggle to keep pace. Wherever they arrive, the crowds have already moved again, another wave in an unpredictable tide. The cost is no longer abstract. It is human. Visible. Escalating. New figures begin to emerge, shaping the direction of the conflict. A young field commander, unknown outside his battalion, earns a reputation for daring night maneuvers that repeatedly outsmart the opposing force. His soldiers describe him as calm, unsettling, and willing to make brutal decisions for even minor advantages. a political strategist with a murky past resurfaces, operating from dimly lit offices far from the front. His influence appears in the sudden arrival of coordinated propaganda and narrative control, carefully crafted messages aimed at both local populations and the world beyond. And then there is the civilian leader who refuses to evacuate her besieged town. Each morning she walks through debris with a small escort, handing out supplies, giving defiant speeches, and insisting the people stay. To some, she is the symbol of resistance. To others, a dangerous idealist gambling with lives. Behind closed doors, political tension tightens. Advisors warn of resource shortages, foreign meddling, and cracks spreading within ranks. Meetings grow heated. Former allies trade accusations. Leaders who were confident at the start now privately question whether their strategies were rooted in foresight or ego. Diplomats issue contradictory statements, circling one another through cautious, chess-like exchanges. Some nations lean forward with subtle gestures of support, others pull back, waiting to see which direction the conflict bends. Every territorial gain sets off a wave of negotiations, counterstatements, and attempts to influence global perception. One faction courts international backers by promising stability and post-war opportunity. Their rivals counter with appeals to heritage and legitimacy, painting themselves as guardians of national identity. Money moves through invisible channels. Arms shipments find their way to remote depots under the cover of night. Loyalties shift quietly, like plates sliding beneath the earth. Eventually, all the scattered clashes, political whispers, and rapid movements begin converging. Something larger is forming, something more organized, more dangerous, and more defining than the chaos that came before. The people caught within it feel the pressure rising like the air before a storm. Soldiers brace. Civilians brace. Leaders position themselves for the moment when momentum will snap and the conflict will evolve into its next, harsher form. The deeper the conflict grew, the more it became clear that the violence everyone could see, the burned-out SUVs on highways, the bodies left as warnings, the shootouts that rattled entire towns, was only a fraction of the real war unfolding. The true battlefield wasn't always the streets or the mountains or the smuggling corridors. It was the places no camera could enter. The offices where the lights stayed on after midnight. The motel rooms paid for in cash. The ranch houses where laughter and whispered threats shared the same table. This was the war fought behind closed doors, where nothing was written down, and every promise had an expiration date. Long before the world noticed the escalation, both Sinaloa operators and CJNG envoys were already making silent moves. They approached mayors who were desperate, police chiefs who were underpaid, army commanders who understood the price of looking the other way. Some accepted out of greed, others out of fear. The lines between loyalty and survival blurred until they were indistinguishable. A handshake could mean protection, or a death sentence. And no one ever knew which until it was too late. It wasn't just local officials. High-ranking figures within federal institutions were quietly choosing sides. Bribes did not move in briefcases, they moved through contracts, construction deals, land permits, seized assets that conveniently disappeared. Every decision tilted the balance of power, even when the public never heard the names of the people pulling those strings. For every soldier deployed to defend a town, another soldier somewhere else was feeding information to the very cartels they were meant to stop. Sinaloa had decades of experience cultivating these relationships. But CJNG had money, fast money, aggressive money, money that didn't wait for loyalty to develop naturally. And in a country where underpayment was the rule, loyalty often belonged to whoever knocked on the door last. Meanwhile, both cartels were expanding their arsenals. These weren't traditional weapons smuggled in the shadows, they were military-grade imports, often acquired through corrupt supply chains and straw buyers far beyond Mexico. Rifles that had crossed borders untouched. Drones rigged with improvised explosives. Armored trucks built in workshops that specialized in battlefield engineering. Entire communities heard the engines of these vehicles before they saw them, and by then it was too late. In many towns, the most heavily armed force wasn't the police, it was whichever cartel arrived first that week. Intelligence became even more valuable than firepower. Sinaloa relied on an older, quieter network, radio operators, local informants, farmers who understood every path through the hills. CJNG invested in surveillance and encrypted communication, building a modern system capable of intercepting calls, tracking patrol routes, and predicting government operations before they even started. Towns that once relied on rumors now function like intelligence outposts, where every new face was a potential threat and every conversation in a market stall could determine who lived to see morning. But behind all of this, behind the weapons, behind the informants, behind the bribes, there were betrayals quietly threading their way through the conflict. A cousin secretly feeding information to the rival cartel. A commander promising neutrality while signaling one side during raids. A lieutenant pretending loyalty while negotiating his own escape plan. These betrayals weren't loud. They didn't make headlines. But they shaped the direction of the war far more than any single gunfight. Some betrayals came from desperation, someone forced to choose between saving their family or protecting their boss. Others came from ambition, those who saw an opportunity to rise if they played both sides just long enough. And some came from fear, which moved through every level of both organizations like a quiet poison. These fractures went unnoticed by the public, but not by the cartels. They watched, they listened, and they punished. A single whisper of disloyalty could erase a name from the world in under an hour. Yet as calculated as these moves were, both Sinaloa and CJNG knew that these unseen maneuvers could only delay the inevitable. Tension was building in too many directions at once. Too many alliances were shifting. Too many promises were breaking. The hidden war had allowed both sides to strengthen themselves behind the curtain, but it also meant that when the curtain finally fell, the explosion would be twice as violent. And the moment that would drop that curtain, the collision that would force every secret, every betrayal, every bargain into the open, was already moving into place. Neither cartel knew exactly when it would happen. But both sensed it. Like the change in the air before a storm. Like the way a room goes silent right before a gunshot. This was the calm before the major turning point. And when it arrived, nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain the same. As the hidden war tightened its grip across Jalisco, Michoacán, Zacatecas, and Sinaloa's outer corridors, the violence no longer moved in predictable lines. It was as if both cartels had begun to fight in shadows cast by shadows, striking without warning, disappearing without trace, and listening to every echo the other left behind. Patrol routes shifted overnight. Intelligence channels dried up. Safe houses became compromised hours after being chosen. Something was changing. Something bigger was brewing. And no one, not even the men giving orders, could fully see it yet. But in every war, there comes a moment when the invisible becomes unmistakably real. A single point where the tension snaps, and the conflict reveals its true face. For the Sinaloa Cartel and the CJNG, that moment arrived on a dusty road outside the small town of Tepocatepec, an ambush so carefully arranged, so devastatingly executed, that even hardened men for whom violence was a language felt a coldness in their bones. It began with information. Too good. Too precise. Too convenient. A CJNG convoy was said to be transporting a high-value target northward, someone whose capture could tilt the power dynamics for months. Sinaloa intel sources insisted the convoy would be lightly guarded, moving in haste after a failed internal purge. For Sinaloa commanders, it smelled like opportunity. For the men on the ground, it smelled like a trap. But opportunity tends to speak louder than doubt. A team of more than 30 Sinaloa gunmen assembled at dawn. They moved quietly, spread across 2 pickup trucks, an armored SUV, and a pair of motorcycles acting as outriders. The plan was simple: intercept, overwhelm, extract, vanish. Minutes after they began rolling, a strange thing happened: radio silence. Not interference. Not jamming. Just absence. No chatter. No updates. No sign of the convoy they were hunting. The road ahead stayed empty, almost unnaturally still. Then the world exploded. The first blast lifted the lead truck into the air, flipping it sideways like a toy. The second detonated beneath the SUV, shredding metal, glass, and bone in a single violent breath. The motorcycles went down instantly, their riders swallowed in dust and heat. Before the survivors could even understand what had happened, automatic fire poured in from 3 directions, slicing through the smoke. CJNG gunmen, more than 50 of them, were positioned in elevated ridges and trenches carved into the terrain. They had been waiting. Watching. Waiting for Sinaloa to walk right into the kill zone. It was a slaughter. One of the Sinaloa survivors later described it in a hushed, shaking voice: "It felt like the sky itself was raining bullets. You couldn't see where to run. You could only hear people screaming and then suddenly not screaming anymore." Men who had survived battles in Sonora, Chihuahua, and Culiacan said they had never experienced anything so sudden, so coordinated, so suffocating. The ambush lasted less than 4 minutes, but for those trapped inside it, time stretched into something unrecognizable, something cruel. A radio call finally broke through the chaos, but by then it was too late. Reinforcements miles away scrambled without direction. The road was unsalvageable. The CJNG shooters continued firing until every wounded body stopped moving. When the final gunshot faded, they descended methodically, stripping weapons, gathering intel, filming proof of victory, and leaving a message that would soon echo across Mexico. CJNG had outplanned, outmaneuvered, and outfought their rivals in a way Sinaloa never expected. For once, Sinaloa was not just struck, they were humiliated. The fallout spread faster than the gunfire that caused it. Families in nearby villages reported hearing not just explosions, but what sounded like entire cliffs collapsing. Army units arrived hours later, too late to help, too early to avoid witnessing the carnage. Videos surfaced online before noon, shaky, raw, brutal, showing vehicles ripped apart, ground scorched black, and messages left by CJNG boasting of the ambush. But the losses ran deeper than the bodies left behind. Among the dead was a mid-level Sinaloa coordinator responsible for managing supply routes through Michoacán. He wasn't a top commander, but he was a crucial mind, a bridge between factions, a master of logistics, a strategist whose absence would cripple operations for weeks. Losing him was like removing a keystone from a bridge. Everything above began to crumble. In the hours that followed, surviving Sinaloa commanders demanded answers. Who leaked the convoy information? Who supplied the coordinates? Who possessed enough knowledge to lure an entire strike team into an ambush mapped with military-level precision? It was too clean. Too perfect. Too reminiscent of a betrayal. Some whispered that CJNG had infiltrators deep inside Sinaloa's networks, people who didn't just pass along intel, but shaped it. Others quietly wondered whether the betrayal came from within their own ranks. After all, power struggles in Sinaloa were no less ruthless than the war itself. And when authority fractures from the inside, enemies rarely need to strike, they simply wait for someone else to pull the trigger. One survivor, limping, burned, and barely conscious, told investigators something chilling. They knew our formation. They knew our timing. They knew the exact minute we would hit that road. Someone gave them everything. Whether he was right or not almost didn't matter. The seed of doubt had been planted. And doubt, in a war like this, spreads faster and kills deeper than bullets. The emotional impact of the ambush reached beyond cartel lines. Families of the fallen rushed to morgues and crime scenes, pleading for access, demanding to know who had survived, who hadn't, and who might still be missing. Mothers cursed the sky. Brothers swore revenge. Children waited in doorways for fathers who would never return. Even among communities long accustomed to cartel violence, this attack felt different. It felt like a shift. A turning point. Something that could not be undone. The CJNG, sensing momentum, released coordinated propaganda within hours, images of captured weapons, drone footage of the ambush site, encrypted messages mocking Sinaloa leadership. They weren't just celebrating victory, they were shaping narrative. They wanted the world to believe they now owned the war. And for a moment, it looked like they did. But wars don't end at their midpoint. They transform. For Sinaloa, humiliation became fuel. Rage became strategy. Grief became focus. Within days, new commanders were appointed, new routes were secured, new alliances were negotiated. The question wasn't whether they would respond, it was how. And when. Because when pride is shattered and blood has been spilled, retaliation is rarely delayed. And those CJNG walked away from the ambush victorious, even they knew the cost. They had revealed their hand. They had shown their tactics. They had demonstrated their reach. And in doing so, they had lit a fire they could no longer control. From this moment on, the war entered a different phase. No more shadow games. No more subtle pushes and quiet maneuvers. The ambush had rewritten the rules. It had turned a covert power struggle into a full, open, unstoppable conflict. Everything that came after, the massacres, the betrayals, the political battles, the strategic realignments, could be traced back to this single moment. The moment the road outside Tepalcatepec erupted. The moment Sinaloa bled heavily for the first time. The moment CJNG declared, without words but with fire, that they were not just competitors, they were equals. And it was this shift, this sudden leveling of the battlefield, that changed the trajectory of the war forever. The retaliation didn't begin with a single gunshot. It arrived like a rising pressure, an invisible hand tightening around an entire region until the first explosion tore through the quiet and made it impossible to pretend the war was contained. In the hours after the devastating midpoint event, both cartels came to the same conclusion: hesitation meant extinction. And so, before investigators even marked the last shell casings on the ground, both organizations unleashed a wave of vengeance that neither the government nor the civilians had the strength to brace for. It started on the highways, those narrow veins of asphalt that kept remote towns alive. Overnight, they became checkpoints of fear. Burned-out cars smoldered along the shoulders. Makeshift barricades appeared where farmers had once sold fruit under the sun. Heavily armed men, faces masked, eyes cold, stood at every turnoff. They weren't there to fight soldiers or rival sicarios. They were there to control movement, to make sure no one slipped through carrying information, weapons, or whispers of betrayal. The first major counterstrike came at dawn. A convoy of trucks rolled into a mining town that had long lived under Sinaloa's shadow. Locals thought they were watching another patrol heading out to the hills. But then the gunmen climbed out, wearing gear too organized, too uniformed to belong to the old guard. They fanned out, took positions, and within minutes the town square was under siege. The message wasn't about territory anymore, it was about humiliation. About sending a wound deep enough that the rival side would feel it in their bones. As news spread to the surrounding villages, fear traveled faster than truth. Some people locked themselves inside their homes. Others packed what they could carry and fled into the hills, praying the gunmen would overlook empty houses. And then came the fires, warehouses torched because they stored supplies that one cartel wanted to deny the other. Entire neighborhoods went dark at night as electrical stations were sabotaged. Darkness, once a blanket of safety for many rural communities, now became a hunting ground. Sinaloa answered within 24 hours. They didn't strike a town, they struck a lifeline. A major roadway that CJNG relied on for transporting fuel and weapons suddenly erupted into chaos. Explosives buried under gravel turned armored convoys into twisted metal. Survivors ran into the brush only to be intercepted by hidden shooters who had waited patiently through the night. It was calculated, merciless, a reminder that Sinaloa had not forgotten how to wage war with patience and precision. The retaliation spiraled in every direction. In one region, CJNG swept through ranches and hid compounds beneath thick canopies of trees, hidden facilities used for manufacturing weapons and modifying vehicles. They seized them, dismantled them, and then set the remains ablaze. In another area, Sinaloa hit CJNG safe houses and dragged out collaborators who had quietly switched sides. Each side wanted to show that betrayal had consequences measured not in death, but in spectacle. And the government, federal police, local authorities, even soldiers sent in with the illusion of control, found themselves overwhelmed. Their equipment was outdated, their intelligence fractured, and their loyalties sometimes unclear. Some officers tried to intervene honestly. Others looked at the size of the convoys rumbling past them and simply stepped aside. Even the brave ones had limits. You cannot stop a tidal wave with a paper shield. Civilians, meanwhile, lived in a landscape where the rules changed every hour. A school bus could drive safely down a road in the morning and be turned around at gunpoint by afternoon. Entire farms were forced to pay for security. Families vanished because someone misread a symbol painted on a wall. Rumors became survival tools, silence became a language spoken by whole towns. The pressure built like a storm. Every day added another layer of violence, another reason for politicians to panic behind closed doors. Mayors stopped answering calls after dark. Journalists were warned, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently, not to publish images or names. Local businesses boarded their windows, not because they feared looting, but because they feared being mistaken for supporters of one side or the other. Power began to shift in ways that had nothing to do with bullets. Some commanders grew paranoid, convinced there were traitors among them. Others grew ambitious, using the chaos to carve out more authority than they had before. Entire cells broke off, claiming loyalty while pursuing their own agendas. With every betrayal and every sudden disappearance, the conflict became less predictable, more volatile. And yet, despite the destruction, there was a strange silence beneath the surface. A feeling that all this violence, the ambushes, the burned towns, the shifting lines, was only the prelude to something larger. Both cartels sensed it. Both prepared for it. Every move, every strike, every message scrawled on a wall carried the weight of an approaching climax. Then came the moment the world could no longer ignore. A single event, violent, public, impossible to hide, pulled the curtain back and made the secret war impossible to deny. It didn't just shock Mexico. It caught the attention of global news networks, foreign governments, and anyone who had ever believed the conflict was distant and contained. But the world was about to take notice. The gunfire that once echoed only through forgotten backroads was now bouncing across the screens of millions. What began as a regional struggle had crossed a threshold, one that neither cartel ever wanted, yet both helped create. The first wave of attention didn't come from governments or intelligence agencies. It came from a shaky cell phone video filmed by someone who shouldn't have been standing that close, who shouldn't have been anywhere near the line of fire. But desperation makes witnesses out of ordinary people, and fear makes those witnesses press upload. Within hours, that video swept through Mexico, then the United States, then the rest of the world. Grainy silhouettes, muzzle flashes in the night, the outline of armored trucks rolling through a small town that had no business seeing that kind of machinery. News outlets didn't need context, they needed ratings. And this footage delivered. Suddenly, what Sinaloa and CJNG tried to contain was being dissected by anchors who couldn't pronounce the town's name. Governments were not prepared. They never are, not for wars they can't publicly acknowledge. Behind diplomatic smiles, however, panic began to spread. Analysts in Washington, Ottawa, Bogota, and Madrid combed through every frame, every audio spike, every visible license plate. Intelligence agencies recognized the trucks. They recognized the tactics. They recognized the escalation for what it truly was, a cartel conflict evolving into something dangerously close to hybrid warfare. Mexico's leadership faced a dilemma that had no good outcome. Publicly, they condemned the violence. Privately, they scrambled. Military commanders argued over strategy, state governors pleaded for reinforcements they knew would arrive too late, federal agencies leaked information to journalists out of frustration, fear, or personal ambition. Some politicians saw opportunity. Others prayed they wouldn't be the next face shown on an anonymous warning banner. Meanwhile, on the streets, an entirely different story was unfolding. Civilians, those who had survived the last 20 years by keeping their heads low and their doors locked, realized that the rules had changed. This wasn't a fight happening in distant hills or hidden ranches. This was happening in markets, in bus stations, outside schools. Entire towns quietly emptied overnight, leaving behind abandoned homes and unanswered phone calls. The pressure from outside Mexico didn't stop. The DEA issued internal memos that were never meant to be seen by the public. Europol flagged suspicious financial transfers routed through Spain and Germany. Intelligence chatter pointed to CJNG expanding their chemical supply chains through Asia, while Sinaloa tightened their grip on smuggling routes in the Pacific. Every move was being watched now, sometimes through satellites, sometimes through drones, and sometimes through corrupt officers pretending to be loyal. And with scrutiny came fractures. Within CJNG, whispers began to circulate, accusations of betrayal, of stolen revenue, of commanders acting without permission. Sinaloa faced its own internal storms, veterans challenging rising leaders, factions disagreeing about how far they should push the conflict, and operatives fearing that the glare of international attention would expose old secrets meant to stay buried forever. Then came the moment that shifted everything, the unexpected arrival of a new power player. Not a cartel. Not a politician. Someone whose appearance would force both Sinaloa and CJNG to reevaluate every move, every alliance, every plan they'd made. Some said he was a diplomat with ties too deep to trace. Others claimed he was a strategist sent by a foreign government tired of watching chaos spill across borders. A few insisted he was something even more dangerous, an investor with no allegiance except to profit, a man who saw opportunity in bloodshed and leverage in desperation. Whoever he truly was, his arrival marked the beginning of a new phase, a silent one, where negotiations took place in dimly lit rooms, and threats were delivered with polite smiles. The cartels noticed his influence immediately. Sinaloa emissaries reported that certain ports were suddenly restricted. CJNG lieutenants discovered their financial channels being quietly frozen. Conversations that once ended in violence now required strategy. And in the shadows, this new figure negotiated with a calmness that unnerved even the most hardened players. But pressure, as always, revealed cracks. Information began leaking from places previously considered impenetrable. Deals that were supposed to remain hidden found their way onto encrypted forums and investigative reports. A reporter in Mexico City received a hard drive under her door. An anonymous email reached a newsroom in Chicago. A trove of documents appeared on servers belonging to a European watchdog group. None of it was coincidence. This wasn't just media attention anymore. This was exposure. Global exposure. And once the world is watching, the conflict can no longer be controlled the same way. It was only a matter of time before one of the cartels made a move that would push the conflict past a line that could never be walked back. And as the pressure tightened from every side, political, international, media, financial, the war began mutating into something far more unpredictable. Allies became liabilities. Deals became traps. And both Sinaloa and CJNG understood that the next move wouldn't just determine control of territory, it would determine who survived the next phase of the conflict at all. Because the world wasn't just watching anymore. The world was closing in. And what came next would push the war toward its most dangerous turning point yet. The hidden war is quiet at first. Almost invisible. While the gunfire still echoes through mountain passes and along rural highways, the real battle begins to drift into boardrooms, back offices, and rooms where no windows exist. This is where the deals are made that never appear in reports, where numbers replace names, and loyalty is something rented by the hour. Quiet meetings between men who were once enemies now take place across shuttered tables. Old rivals discover that desperation is the strongest form of negotiation. Someone always needs something: safe passage, silence, protection, a name erased from a list. And in exchange, something else is always given. Corruption spreads not in waves, but in threads. A local official looks the other way. A shipment moves uninspected. A patrol route shifts just enough to create a gap at exactly the right time. Pieces are repositioned slowly, carefully, so that no single move appears deliberate on its own. Police units grow divided. Some act on genuine belief. Some act on fear. Some act because the money offered outweighs the risks of refusing it. Military deployments arrive with promises of order, yet their presence often signals that something far larger is unfolding just beneath the surface. Intelligence leaks not through dramatic betrayals, but through casual remarks, misplaced files, and unguarded conversations in rooms where everyone assumes they are alone. Both sides continue to arm themselves in ways that grow increasingly difficult to track. Weapons arrive through routes that never appear on official maps. Allies appear from places no one expected. Information becomes the most valuable currency of all: who is moving where, who is losing the confidence of their men, who is quietly preparing to defect. Some betrayals happen so quietly that they remain unnoticed for weeks, even months. Commanders are sent into traps believing they are walking into victories. Supply convoys vanish without warning and without explanation. Entire units are reassigned only hours before critical attacks, just enough to ensure failure while making it look like miscalculation. And throughout all of this, the civilians cannot see any of it. They only feel its consequences. Markets close early. Streets fall silent sooner each night. Rumors become more reliable than news broadcasts. Everyone senses that something deeper is shifting beneath the surface, something that no one fully understands yet. Then comes the moment that no amount of secrecy can contain. It begins as an operation meant to reset the balance, an aggressive maneuver designed to cripple the opposing side's momentum in one decisive move. The plan is bold. The intelligence appears solid. The timing seems perfect. The target is isolated. The force assembled is confident. Everything about it feels calculated for success. But hidden within the plan is a flaw no one sees in time. The convoy moves before dawn. The radio chatter is calm. The terrain seems quiet. Too quiet. The lead vehicles advance through a narrow corridor where mountains rise on both sides like walls. Then the first explosion hits not from the front, but from behind. The rear escort disappears in a cloud of fire and debris. Before anyone can react, the ridgelines ignite with gunfire. The valley becomes an echo chamber of explosions and screams. Vehicles attempt to reverse and collide. Some try to push forward into obstacles that were placed hours earlier. The operation collapses into chaos in less than 60 seconds. What follows is not a battle. It is a slaughter. Those who survive do so by accident, not by strategy. Some escape through ravines. Some play dead beneath wreckage. Others crawl for hours before reaching the nearest civilization. By the time reinforcements arrive, the silence has returned, but the damage is irreversible. The loss is staggering. Leaders vanish. Entire units cease to exist. And for the first time, both sides realize that the war has crossed a threshold it can never retreat from. One survivor later describes the sounds not as gunfire, but as metal tearing apart the sky. The emotional shock ripples far beyond the battlefield. Families wait for men who never return. Towns brace for retaliation they know is coming. Across the region, every commander now understands the same thing: the rules have changed. Caution has failed. Restraint has failed. Whatever comes next will be driven by revenge. Retaliation does not arrive as a single strike. It comes as a storm. Counterattacks erupt in every direction at once. Towns that were once contested become utterly consumed. Roads are seized within hours and lost again days later. Barricades appear overnight. Convoys control entire stretches of highway. Government pressure increases, but every intervention seems to fracture something else in its place. Officials issue statements they no longer fully believe. Emergency deployments fail to stabilize territory already burning from within. The power structure tilts violently from one side to the other and back again, so fast that even those fighting can't keep pace with the shifting momentum. The conflict begins to pull in people who never chose to be part of it. Farmers abandon land their families have kept for generations. Teachers stop showing up to schools that no longer exist. Hospitals operate on backup power for weeks at a time. Every retaliatory strike solves one problem while creating 3 more. Every apparent victory plants the seeds of the next disaster. And then, inevitably, the world begins to notice. Footage leaks. Not curated. Not filtered. Raw clips shake across screens far beyond the region. Images circulate faster than officials can contain them. Evidence emerges that contradicts public narratives. International observers begin asking questions that no one is prepared to answer. Foreign agencies quietly expand their presence. Surveillance increases. Pressure builds on governments already struggling to contain the situation within their own borders. Crackdowns are announced with confidence and carried out with confusion. Some succeed. Some collapse. Arrests are made that create more problems than they solve. Inside the organizations themselves, fractures widen. Commanders begin to distrust their own ranks. Cells splinter. Internal executions rise. Once unified operations now suffer from hesitation, misinformation, and fear of infiltration. And amid the uncertainty, a new figure begins to surface. Someone not previously visible. Someone with resources, intelligence, and motive. Their arrival does not calm the war, it reshapes it. The balance bends again. But by now, there is no returning to how things were. The conflict has grown beyond territory. Beyond revenge. Beyond pride. It has become a self-sustaining machine powered by loss, loyalty, and the inability of either side to step away without collapse. Every move forward drags the past behind it. Every decision echoes across cities, borders, and families who had nothing to do with the first spark. And as the violence continues, as pressure mounts from every direction, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This war was never just about who would control the most valuable territory. It was about what happens when power grows faster than restraint. When loyalty becomes a liability. And when an entire system feeds itself on the illusion that the next strike will finally be the one that ends it all. It never is. And somewhere in the darkness, even now, voices are still calling out over the radio. For reinforcements that may never arrive. For wars that may never truly end. The hidden war is never announced with sirens or gunfire. It begins in whispers. In untraceable phone calls made on borrowed devices. In quiet meetings that never appear on official calendars. As the public sees chaos on the streets, a slower, more dangerous conflict unfolds behind closed doors, one fought with money, information, and influence. Deals are struck in back rooms of businesses that appear legitimate by day and corrupt by night. Names are never written down. Promises are sealed with silence, not signatures. And every agreement carries the unspoken threat that betrayal is not only possible, it is expected. Corruption seeps into every layer meant to prevent the violence. Some officers begin rerouting patrols away from flashpoints minutes before attacks occur. Others tip off targets just early enough for escape, but too late for safety. Military-grade weapons cross borders through channels disguised as commercial shipments. Intelligence meant to dismantle operations instead becomes a roadmap for survival. Both sides are no longer just fighting each other, they are feeding on the same broken system that was designed to stop them. And while the streets burn, the true betrayals go unnoticed. A commander defects quietly. A supply chain changes hands under the cover of an accounting adjustment. A trusted intermediary vanishes without explanation. Each invisible shift weakens one side while strengthening the other, tipping the balance in ways the public will not understand until it is far too late. The moment the war breaks into full daylight does not arrive with warning. It comes through miscalculation. A planned operation meant to cripple leadership instead walks directly into a trap. Convoys move at night believing the roads are clear. The intel is confident. The timing precise. But someone has already spoken. Somewhere along the chain, loyalty changed sides. The ambush erupts with terrifying speed. Vehicles are boxed in from both directions. Gunfire tears through metal and glass. Communications collapse into static and screaming voices. The firefight lasts only minutes, but the aftermath stretches for miles. Burned-out trucks smolder in silence. Dozens lie dead where they fell. The survivors scatter into the darkness carrying wounds that will never fully heal. One voice emerges days later from the wreckage, a man who lived by pretending to be dead beneath twisted steel and bodies that never moved again. His account is halting. His hands shake as he describes the moment he realized the operation had been betrayed from within. He remembers hearing familiar voices over enemy radios. He remembers understanding, in that instant, that the rules of the conflict had changed forever. That single night resets the entire war. Fear shifts direction. Leadership is questioned. Retaliation becomes inevitable. And when retaliation comes, it comes without restraint. Entire towns wake to the sound of engines and gunfire before dawn. Roads are seized. Checkpoints appear overnight. Flags rise on rooftops where government symbols once stood. Families flee with nothing but documents in memory. Counterattacks strike with surgical intent, hitting infrastructure, supply routes, and perceived collaborators. What was once a battle for territory becomes a battle for humiliation and dominance. Government officials issue statements promising control, yet their convoys cannot pass through without permission. Military deployments surge, only to withdraw weeks later under pressure that never becomes public. Power shifts violently back and forth. Each side scores blows that seem decisive until the next strike proves otherwise. The fighting is no longer hidden in rural shadows, it now threatens to spill openly across borders. And just as the violence reaches its most unstable point, the world finally begins to watch. Drone footage circulates online. Surveillance clips leak anonymously. International media floods the region. Analysts argue on broadcast panels while locals dig graves. Foreign agencies begin quietly tracking movements, freezing accounts, monitoring communications. Some attempt intervention. Others observe, calculating which outcome will benefit them most. Inside the organizations, fractures appear. Younger commanders question orders. Veterans resent changing strategies. Splinter groups break off, seeking personal advantage in the chaos. And then, a new figure enters the picture. A shadow power broker whose name has circulated for years but whose involvement was never confirmed. His arrival is subtle. His impact is immediate. Routes reopen that were thought sealed. Operations shift with uncanny precision. And both sides realize too late that the game board has just expanded beyond their control. The final phase of this chapter of the war is not decided by the loudest strike, but by the quietest move. An unexpected withdrawal here. A sudden alliance there. A leader once thought invulnerable disappears from public view. And then comes the operation no one saw coming. Not the authorities. Not regional analysts. Not even rival commanders on the same side of the war. It unfolds with chilling efficiency. Information is cut. Communications go blind. By the time the truth emerges, control has already changed hands. Yet the victory is incomplete. Whatever was gained carries a cost so severe that it breaks internal unity on both sides. The conflict no longer has a single face, a single voice, or a single strategy. It is fractured into something far harder to contain. The war, it seems, has survived its own climax. And in the uneasy quiet that follows, everyone waits for what comes next. Because the truth is this, no matter who claims victory tonight, tomorrow belongs to whoever adapts faster. Alliances will continue to shift. Leaders will continue to fall. And the territory that started this war remains exactly what it has always been, the most valuable prize on the map. But the most dangerous question remains unanswered. Was this only one chapter? Or merely the beginning of something far worse? Because in the shadows, the survivors are already regrouping. And the next move will be unlike anything seen before. They say wars end with treaties. This one ends with silence. No announcement. No confirmation. Only a growing sense that the people who walked away from the bloodshed did not walk away from the war. Because somewhere out there tonight, plans are already in motion. And when the next shot is fired, It won't just redraw territory. It will redefine everything.